They walked into my company like they owned the place, uniforms sharp, voices loud, and authority assumed. The HOA Patrol expected fear, compliance, and silence. What they didn't expect was resistance. This wasn't a quiet office they could bully into submission. The moment they crossed the line, I decided I wouldn't bend, I wouldn't apologize, and it started like so many HOA horror stories do, not with a letter, not with a warning, but with an assumption of absolute authority. Early that morning, my company was already active. Employees were arriving, machinery was humming, phones were ringing, and business was moving forward like any normal workday. That sense of routine shattered the moment several vehicles pulled up outside bearing the unmistakable markings of the HOA Patrol. They didn't walk in cautiously. They didn't ask permission. They didn't request a meeting. They stormed in. The HOA Patrol entered my company's property with stiff posture, clipped steps, and an air of entitlement that suggested they believed they owned the place. Their uniforms were clean, their badges prominently displayed, and their expressions practiced, stern, dismissive, and confident. This wasn't their first time intimidating someone. They expected compliance before they even opened their mouths. From the very beginning, their tone made their intentions clear. They weren't there to discuss. They weren't there to clarify. They were there to command. One of them immediately began issuing orders, telling employees where they could and couldn't stand, demanding access to areas they had no legal right to enter, and questioning operations that were none of their business. They spoke loudly, deliberately, making sure everyone nearby could hear. Intimidation thrives on an audience, and they knew it. Their assumption was simple: this is an HOA matter. You will obey. But what they failed to understand, what HOAs often fail to understand, is that authority only exists where the law allows it. And this was not one of those places. The patrol claimed there were violations. They referenced HOA bylaws as if they were universal law, waving vague rules around without specifying how, where, or why they applied to my company. When asked for written notices, they deflected. When asked for jurisdiction, they grew irritated. When asked for proof, their confidence cracked just slightly, but not enough to stop them. Instead, they leaned harder into intimidation. They threatened fines, massive ones. They hinted at forced shutdowns. They suggested legal action without naming statutes. Every statement was carefully designed to create fear rather than clarity. They expected panic. They expected scrambling. They expected me to fold under pressure like so many others before me. That expectation came from experience. HOA patrols survive on unchecked power. They are used to homeowners who don't know their rights, small business owners who don't want trouble, and individuals who assume resistance will only make things worse. Most people comply not because they are wrong, but because fighting back feels exhausting. The HOA Patrol knew this, and relied on it. They tried to separate me from my staff, insisting discussions happen privately, a classic tactic meant to isolate and dominate. They spoke over me when I asked questions. They dismissed my concerns as irrelevant. One even smirked when I mentioned legal boundaries, as if the very idea of limits on their authority was laughable. That smirk said everything. To them, power wasn't something to justify, it was something to assume. But intimidation has a fatal flaw: it only works if the target is afraid. And fear disappears the moment someone understands their rights. As they continued pushing, their overreach became obvious. They demanded access to private company records without warrants. They attempted to photograph restricted areas without consent. They ordered operational changes that would have caused financial losses, all without any legal backing whatsoever. Each demand crossed another line. This wasn't enforcement. This was harassment. At that point, it became clear that the HOA Patrol wasn't acting on law, they were acting on habit. They had grown so comfortable abusing authority that they no longer bothered to check whether it applied. Their confidence wasn't rooted in legality, but in past success bullying others into submission. That's the real danger of HOA overreach. When no one pushes back, abuse becomes routine. As the confrontation escalated, cracks began to show. When asked to cite specific statutes, they couldn't. When told their bylaws didn't apply to commercial operations outside HOA governance, they became defensive. Their voices grew sharper. Their threats grew louder, but their arguments grew weaker. That's when the shift happened. The same patrol members who entered with swagger now started glancing at each other. The same people issuing commands minutes earlier began rephrasing them as requests. Authority that isn't real collapses quickly when challenged. And they knew it. One patrol member attempted to save face by escalating, mentioning police involvement. But even that threat fell flat. Without jurisdiction, without cause, and without legal grounding, they had nothing. Calling actual law enforcement would only expose their overreach. They realized they had miscalculated. They expected obedience. They encountered resistance. And resistance exposed everything. What made this moment powerful wasn't shouting or aggression, it was calm refusal. Calm documentation. Calm insistence on legality. Every sentence they spoke was met with a question they couldn't answer. Every demand was met with a request for proof they didn't have. The intimidation tactic unraveled in real time. Employees who had initially stepped back began watching closely. Some recorded, some whispered. The psychological balance shifted. Fear drained from the room, and flowed straight back toward the HOA Patrol. Because bullies panic when they lose control. Eventually, the patrol backed down, not formally, not apologetically, but unmistakably. They stopped issuing orders. They stopped threatening fines. They began talking about, following up later, and reviewing the situation. The storm-in had turned into a retreat. They left without accomplishing a single thing. And that moment proved something crucial. HOA power is often an illusion, one that only exists when no one challenges it. This wasn't just a win for my company. It was a lesson in how intimidation operates, how overreach thrives, and how quickly false authority collapses when confronted by knowledge and resolve. The HOA Patrol came expecting obedience. They left exposed. And that was only the beginning. The moment I realized the HOA Patrol wasn't backing down, I knew this confrontation would decide more than just the day's outcome. This wasn't only about my company, it was about whether intimidation would win or whether standing firm would finally expose the limits of their power. I chose the second option. Instead of raising my voice or matching their aggression, I did something they weren't prepared for. I slowed everything down. Every command they gave was met with a question. Every accusation was met with a request for proof. Every threat was met with calm, documented resistance. The more composed I remained, the more uncomfortable they became. HOA patrols are trained to dominate chaos, not clarity. One patrol member tried to assert control by stepping closer, invading personal space, and speaking louder. It was a clear, intimidation tactic meant to trigger fear or anger. Either would have worked in their favor. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply asked him to state his authority again, clearly, and on record. That request alone shifted the energy in the room. They began repeating vague phrases, community standards, compliance requirements, HOA authority, but none of it was tied to law. When I pointed out that my company was not under HOA governance, they pivoted, claiming the property was affected by HOA rules. When pressed to explain how, they couldn't. Their confidence was built on assumption, not legality. At that point, I instructed my staff to continue working as normal. This was deliberate. It sent a clear message. Operations would not stop just because someone in a uniform demanded it. The patrol didn't like that. One of them ordered employees to step away from certain areas. I immediately countered, stating that only law enforcement with proper cause could issue such orders. For the first time, they hesitated. That hesitation mattered. They attempted to regain momentum by threatening fines, daily fines, escalating fines, penalties severe enough to shut this place down. I asked for the written notice authorizing those fines. Silence followed. They exchanged looks. One patrol member muttered something about processing paperwork later. Later is where false authority goes to die. As the pressure increased, so did their mistakes. One patrol member began taking photos without permission, pointing his camera towards sensitive company areas. I calmly informed him that he was trespassing and that continued recording would be documented as harassment. His hand lowered slowly. The power dynamic shifted again. This wasn't a fight of strength, it was a fight of composure. The more they pushed, the more exposed they became. Their language softened from commands to suggestions. Their posture changed from aggressive to defensive. The same people who stormed in expecting obedience were now searching for a way out without losing face. That's when they made their biggest miscalculation. One of them threatened to call the police. He said it confidently, as if it would instantly end the confrontation. But the threat backfired. I agreed immediately, and welcomed it. I stated clearly that I would cooperate fully with actual law enforcement and would also be providing documentation of the HOA Patrol's overreach, trespassing, and attempted interference with a private business. The room went quiet. They hadn't expected agreement. They had expected fear. Calling real authorities would mean scrutiny. It would mean explaining why an HOA patrol was operating outside its jurisdiction. It would mean answering questions they didn't want asked. The threat dissolved the moment it was examined. That's when the tables truly turned. I began outlining their actions calmly and methodically. Unauthorized entry, disruption of business operations, verbal threats without legal backing, and misuse of HOA authority. I stated that everything was being documented and that any further interference would result in formal complaints and legal action. For the first time, the HOA Patrol was on defense. They tried to de-escalate, talking about misunderstandings and clarifying boundaries. The same people who minutes earlier demanded obedience were now negotiating. They suggested follow-up meetings, reviews, and internal discussions. None of it changed the reality. They had lost control of the situation. And they knew it. As they prepared to leave, their body language said everything. No more barking orders. No more threats. No more authority. They walked out the same way bullies always do when confronted, with frustration, embarrassment, and silence. But the impact didn't end there. Their retreat sent a powerful message to everyone watching. Employees saw that intimidation could be challenged. Witnesses saw that authority must be proven, not assumed. And the HOA Patrol learned a lesson they had avoided for years: power collapses the moment someone refuses to surrender to it. What they expected to be a routine enforcement turned into an exposure of their limits. What they believed would be obedience became resistance. And what they assumed was control became accountability. From that day forward, the dynamic changed completely. The HOA Patrol no longer treated my company as an easy target. Communications became formal. Threats disappeared. Everything had to be written, reviewed, and justified. Their casual abuse of authority had been replaced by caution. That's the true victory in standing your ground. Not humiliation, not revenge, but forcing accountability where none existed before. The HOA Patrol walked in expecting submission. They walked out knowing they had pushed too far. And once that line is crossed, it can never be uncrossed. Definitely wouldn't back down. What followed turned their power trip into a confrontation they'll never forget.